Milling Through History presents the Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
When the Spanish Inquisition comedy routine was introduced to the world by the Monty Python Flying Circus, audiences would immediately see this as a classic from the group and would start to repeat the famed line, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition." And yet, as people started to go ahead and repeat this famed line, what they did not realize was that they were actually continuing on a legacy of misinformation about the event. As such, scholars who have researched the Inquisition have discovered that it really wasn't quite what people thought it was, and instead, there is more to it than meets the eye. The Spanish Inquisition was created under the authority of Ferdinand and Isabella, the same duo who sent Christopher Columbus to the New World. And the whole purpose of it was to maintain Catholic orthodoxy in their combined kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, which would form the basis of Spain. Now, it was meant specifically to find heretics in the country from those who had recently converted from being Jews or Muslims into Christianity, specifically Catholicism. Now, the reason for this conversion was because Spain had issued decrees telling those who were Jewish or Muslim that they would either need to convert over to Christianity or be deported. Now, how the Inquisition started has been greatly debated amongst historians. While they agree the year was 1478, the cause behind it is where there's a great deal of controversy. There's no one single answer. One of the main reasons, though, is that the Inquisition was designed specifically to go after heretics. One group of heretics, which Christian Catholics had seen, were those who were Jewish. And what had happened was Jews were converting over to Catholicism because Spanish decree had said those who were not Catholic would have to pay taxes, while those who were Catholic did not. And so, seeing an opportunity to avoid taxation, Jews were converting to Catholicism in name only. Meanwhile, they were remaining at home and still practicing their faith. Known as the conversos, these Jews would go ahead and be persecuted under Spanish law. And with the Inquisition, focus was directed specifically upon them. The reason for this is that Ferdinand and Isabella lived in a time in which the divine right of kings was unquestioned, and because they both represented God's representatives on earth to rule in his authority, it was necessary to ensure that all people within their kingdom were Catholic and therefore were very respectful of the monarchy. So they needed to ensure all people were actually devout in their faith. Spain, ironically enough, did have a long history of coexistence between the Catholics, the Jews, and the Muslims. During the reign of the Moors over Spain, this degree of coexistence and tolerance was actually quite high in comparison to that of mainland Europe. There are those historians who argue that after the English and the French had expelled all of their Jews from their borders, that most of Europe looked down upon Spain because of its mixed cultural identity, and that as such, the Spanish were attempting to catch up with the rest of the way in which Europe was presenting themselves as being Christian nations that had only a single religion within it. Ironically, though, one of the biggest loopholes that came within the Inquisition was its rules for how they would prosecute people. The Inquisition was only meant to go after heretical Christians, therefore heretical Catholics. In the event a Muslim or a Jew were found to have gone ahead and converted, but had still been practicing their faith, if they were to say, "No, I am still a fully active Jew or Muslim," then they would be released from the trial because the Inquisition did not have any authority over those individuals. So how did the Inquisition actually work? The process was very organized. And as such, there were certain rules which needed to be done. The first step was the accusation, wherein the Inquisition would arrive at a certain town or city, and people then were given a period of grace to confess their sins without severe punishment. The true purpose of this, though, was to get the people to make accusations and collect evidence against them. Eventually, the grace period was dropped, and anonymous confessions occurred, which meant anyone could be accused. Often, this meant if you had a grudge against another person, then revenge could be given without anyone knowing the wiser. This would be just one of many weapons that the Inquisitors would have when ensuring that they could create fear amongst all the people.
Amongst our weaponry are such diverse elements as fear, strife, ruthless rigidity, and almost fanatical devotion to the Pope.
Following the accusation that would be placed upon somebody, detention would occur. People would be arrested and placed into prison for long periods of time. Their property would be confiscated, and all their property would be used specifically to pay for their trial and confinement. Whether or not a person would actually know the charges that were levied against them was generally unknown, but more times than not, they would have no idea as to why they were sitting in prison, and therefore would be sitting in their cell guessing as to what it was that got them placed there to begin with. When it came time for the trial, Inquisition trials were surprisingly very well documented and preserved, with the answers of every question asked to them written down. As a result, the exact length of the trial and the way in which it occurred gave historians an ability to recreate it and thus know exactly at what point a person might find themselves either confirming that they were guilty or proving they were innocent. In addition to being well written, Inquisition trials were surprisingly far more fair than people believed. Depending on the power of the monarchy at the time, the degree of the fairness of the trial would vary. If the king was a person who was open to allowing a bit more flexibility, then the inquisitors themselves were flexible. But if the monarchy was actually much more hard-lined, then the inquisitors would be hard-lined. And yet, when it came to torture, the Inquisition was allowed to use it, but under certain rules. The Inquisition could only be used as a means of getting information when all other options were exhausted. Ironically, no maiming was allowed, along with mutilation, drawing of blood, or permanent damage to the body. So the person had to be able to walk away from the torture. Granted, they might be feeling very sore and wishing something far worse would have happened to them, but they should be able to at least physically leave the torture chamber. The frequency depended on the crime, but a person could be easily tortured as little as once or twice to as many times as 8. And the length of this torture would only be for 15 minutes. And a doctor would be there at all times to supervise the torture and ensure that no harm would occur to the person in question. When your trial was completed, sentencing would occur. Now, very rarely were people ever acquitted of the crime. Usually, cases were suspended, and the fear of having your trial restart was always left open, meaning that for the rest of your life, as long as the Inquisition was in effect, you never knew if you might find yourself getting arrested once again. Verdicts of penance or reconciliation were often used, and your penance usually involved heavy fines, meaning that your property, which has already been exhausted in order to pay for your confinement, would be further wiped out, thus ensuring you would remain poor unless you had a means of recouping your losses in a very timely manner. And finally, most verdicts would result in going to what was called the auto de fe.
Auto de fe? What's an auto de fe?
That's a really good question. The auto de fe is the actual public sentencing that would occur from the Inquisition. This would be a massive event where people from all over the area would come to see exactly what the heretics would be sentenced with. Now, those who were found not guilty were told to drop to their knees and provide thanksgiving towards the inquisitors and specifically to God himself. Those who were found guilty would have their punishments carried out, and the most extreme punishment of them all would be the burning of the stake. And this particular punishment is the one which would survive throughout all of history. People would always remember this particular event, and therefore it is from the most extreme punishment that many of the other extreme stories of the Inquisition would survive over time. Through the centuries, though, the Inquisition would continuously pop up, and as such, it seems rather clear that perhaps
But the Inquisition's here and it's here to stay.
and while there was a great fear that the Inquisition really would last forever, its influence would eventually drop, namely with the beginning of the French Revolution. Because of revolutionary France and its eventual invasion of Spain, the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte would actually break the power of the Inquisition. And in 1834, the Inquisition would come to an end, having lasted for over 350 years, a very long period of time. And as such, what would end up happening is the legend of the Inquisition would last for almost another 100+ years. In fact, most scholarly research would only focus on the severity of the Inquisition, and starting in 1976, a much more thorough look at the Inquisition began to occur amongst historians. And as they did so, new books would be written showing that the Inquisition, while notorious, was not as violent or cruel as initially thought. As such, what people did not expect is that while it was difficult, the Spanish Inquisition itself didn't exactly have what they thought it was. And so, now that you know what occurred within the Spanish Inquisition, you know exactly what to expect.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. And we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.